Dr. Taryn Whitten. All right. Dr. Whitten is a native of Boston. She obtained her bachelor's degree from the Boston University in mathematics and physics in 1972. She earned a master's degree in mathematical physics at Indiana University at Bloomington, my alma mater. And then another master's degree and PhD in mathematical biology at the State University of New York of Buffalo Center for Theoretical Biology. Following her doctoral years, she spent postdoctoral research time at the Department of Biometry at the Medical University of South Carolina. She then moved to the Department of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Southern California. She has held faculty and other appointments at numerous academic institutions, some of which she held positions in the Department of Mathematics at the University of California at Santa Barbara, the Illinois Institute of Technology. She had an appointment in medicine at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. She had an appointment in computer science at the Speed Scientific School of Engineering and Mathematics at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. She has also spent some time at the Center for High Performance Computing at the University of Texas. She spent some time at the University of Michigan Medical School. And she also spent a little bit of time in the private sector with the Planning Research Corporation and the ETA Systems Control Data Corporation developing mathematical modeling software. To put it succinctly, she's been around. Her research focuses on the development of dynamic mathematical and computational models for biological systems and processes. She has applied these models to the study of the aging process and the study of cancer through cellular population modeling, but she has also applied her methods to epidemiological studies of public health issues, specifically the problem of violence in minority populations, women's health, and gender-related issues. She has a special interest in the health and well-being of LGBT persons in the LGBT community and has published 2 books on this topic. The Tao of Gender was published by the Green Dragon Press when it came out in 2002. And a second book, Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Aging, Challenges in Research, Practice, and Policy, which was co-edited with A. Evan Eiler, was published by the Johns Hopkins University Press, and that came out in 2012. Today, she will apply her methods to the topic of sustainable systems. And her talk, sort of changed slightly at the last minute, is called How Do You Unchop a Tree? That's a great title. A complexity theorist takes on sustainability. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Taryn Whitten.
Am I on now? Can you hear me? I'm green here. See, green, get it? Work with me, come on. Okay, so here's the brief talk outline. Please feel free to interrupt. It's better that way. I want you to think of this as just a dynamic interaction between us. I always have more to say than there is time, so I'd rather you went away feeling satisfied than I rushed through it and you went, oh my God, I didn't understand a thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of how we do scientific analysis and how complexity theory arose. Where did it come from? What is it even? And then I'm going to take on the task of trying to define this thing called sustainability and try to interface the two and leave you like whew, at the end. So here we go. So here's the challenge. We know we can break things apart, okay? That's easy to do, okay? And the question then is, well, but that's not really how the system is. We want to be able to look at the whole thing and not break it apart and understand how it works. So that's part one. And then part two is most ecological systems that we would think about sustainable organisms or sustainable systems, I should say, have multiple parts to them. So if you know something about the monkeys and something about the trees, but you really want to know about how the monkeys and the trees work together, that's kind of a hard problem. And that's where complexity theory really has some bearing. So I want to understand cat. Okay? So how am I going to understand cat? And I happen to love cats. It says so right there, you see. And so the century-old traditional scientific approach was called reductionism, and basically this is what you did. You know, you cut the thing apart with various tools, and then you banged it on the head with one of your hammers, and you got pieces, right? Everybody agree? Is there anybody who disagrees? It has a new way that I don't know about? Okay. So then you would study the pieces, okay? All right, we have to wait for her to finish studying. Okay, I think, no, more. Okay, so anyhow, you'd study the pieces, you make inferences about the pieces, how they behaved, but what you really wanted was to put the things back together again. The problem is that, well, you didn't get quite cat when you put them all back together. Something's missing. In fact, many things are missing. And so one of the challenges that complexity theory takes on is the idea of, well, what is it that could be missing? And not just what connections are missing, but are there more esoteric things that are missing? And we'll get to that in a little bit. So along came the ecologists, and the ecologists are really the inventors of systems theory. In about 1906, a gentleman named von Bertalanffy started the whole idea of systems theory and general systems theory. And from that emerged the General Systems Society and the whole idea of, well, we need to look at these things as modules that interact in a way. We can't just slam them apart. There's something more to this. And particularly because in ecology, if you're in the jungle, you've got monkeys and birds and insects and trees. And, you know, so there's a whole bunch of things interacting. And so they started to think about the idea of, well, interactions. Okay? And so ecologists had these challenges. They wanted to study items made up of multiple subsystems. These subsystems were not necessarily perfectly understood, okay, and often studied by the hammer approach, okay? And if there were linkages, a lot of them weren't really known, or they were inferred, or they were hypothesized. So what's an example of that? Okay, well, here's an example of 4 landscapes. I just wanted to show you an example of a model so that you'd all go, all right, ready? Ooh, ah. Okay, thank you. And you'd see, this is an example of 4 little landscapes that they put together to model a particular area. The citation is up there if you're really thrilled. But it's a composite 4 landscape system to model the various behaviors in the landscape. And you can see they get pretty complicated very easily. But you also notice that there are like boxes that represent processes or things and arrows that represent flows. And so ecological systems, people realized, had these basic concepts built into them, and they needed to understand more about it because you didn't want to write all the math down to do this, because this is a system of differential equations and parameters you didn't necessarily know, and so you really couldn't tell much about it. So systems biology basically was take a reductive study of the parts of the system, try to glue them back together, and see how well your system really works by putting the pieces back together again. There's a problem with this methodology, okay? It works kind of okay, but not necessarily well, okay? Because there were some things that happened. So let's consider a simpler example. Okay, why were you late? What's your excuse? Oh, I'm very good at embarrassing people. That's part of my... And you're on tape, by the way, so...
The campus connectors dropped us off at Main and Monroe. I had to walk up here.
Oh, okay. That works. So let's consider a simpler example, all right? The 7 bridges of Königsberg. This is a classic example in studying network theory because it has a built-in problem. This is an actual true city. This isn't a make-up problem. There are 7 bridges in here. They're kind of hard to see, but here's one, and you can look around and you can find them. I'm going to regraph this for you. So I'm going to get rid of all the buildings. And that's what it kind of looks like. So there are the bridges and there are the rivers. So that's basically how it's set up. Now, for all of you, I want to do a little exam. Some of you may have seen me do this before. If you have, shh. If you haven't, that's fine. I want you to take out your air finger, and I want you to mentally try to cross every one of the bridges without doubling back on any of them. Can you do it? The answer is no, you can't. There's no way that you can possibly do it. Now, let's say that I applied my reductive hammer to this, and I happen to break bridge number 7 away. Okay, so there's the same picture. Try the same thing. All right? So there's an interesting, there is a property that just disappeared because you broke it apart. Okay? So there are things that happen, come on in, things that happen when you break things apart, properties that you may not have even known were there, and they disappear. So something about this, and this is a simple example, but biological systems are obviously much more complicated. And so what happens is you may, when you break things apart, and it doesn't have to be biological systems, that just happens to be because I'm an MD also and I like these things. But the fact is that, you know, you can talk about business systems, you can talk about corporate systems, you can talk about trucking systems. It really doesn't matter. Anything that has a lot of complexity to it, things will happen when you break things apart or add connectivity. So, somehow unexpected properties emerge or disappear, dissolve, when you break things apart. And that word emerge is going to be a critical thing when we talk about complexity theory. But there are other examples that can happen. And I'll just go through a couple of them. How many of you know about when you throw 4 women into a dorm room, they all sync to one person's menstrual cycle, right? Everybody, men, I don't expect you to know that unless you've been in the dorm room yourself, but the fact is they do. There's a kind of a pheromonic synchronization that happens. So synchrony happens. Have you ever seen fireflies in the trees start to sync up and they all start to blink together? Okay, that's another example of synchrony. Each individual behaves individually, but somehow when you put them in a group, they all start to make little connections. And it may be just by the firefly behavior signals. We don't necessarily know. You can also have swarming. Okay, you've all seen the flocks of birds do this, and fish in the sea do swarm. Anybody not seen a swarm before? Okay. If I asked you to describe the individual behavior of a bird, could you necessarily describe how a swarm behaves? Any volunteers? Exam tomorrow? Well, the answer is no, you can't, because there's group phenomenon that happen. And when you break the group apart, you lose that phenomenon, okay? So there are many examples. Chaotic behavior is another kind of example. Bifurcation, where if you just push something just a little way, the behavior goes off in a whole radically different direction, all right, unexpectedly, all right? So all of these kinds of behaviors got the attention of mathematicians and physicists, particularly physicists. They started this field of complexity theory. And they got in and they started asking questions, okay? Like, is it all in how you look at it? So here's an example of what I talk about when I say if you break something apart, you don't necessarily know what the whole object looks like. So here's a simple example. The main object is this thing up in the middle here. If you project a light that way, measurement, think of measuring, then you get an E as the result of your measure. If you project a light that way, you get a G. If you project a light that way, you get a B. So you get 3 different answers depending on which way you look at it. And complexity theorists and quantum mechanics, we're all about that kind of stuff, measuring and worrying about the philosophy of measurement and everything. But here is a specific example, a real-world example of it matters how you look at it, okay, very specifically. So complexity theorists and physicists are going, yummy, this is really good. So Physicists invade systems biology in about the 1960s historically, and what we get is the emergence of two new disciplines: dynamical systems theory, which is the math behind all of this and the physics, and complexity theory, which is the more philosophical side of what we do. So everybody with me so far? Any questions? Really? Wow. Okay, so let's talk about what are complex systems now, okay? So, because I know that's the question you really wanted to ask me, right? But you just didn't have the nerve, right? So, all right, this is a kind of busy slide. I tried to highlight the things that I thought were really important. So when you are somebody who has been in the business for a while and you want to talk about, well, how to explain complex systems to people, you look at all the kinds of complex systems you see, and eventually what you find is there are basic properties of complex systems that you see no matter what you're really looking at. One of them is this idea of emergent behavior. If you know about one bird, that doesn't tell you how a flock of birds will behave. In other words, you can't predict swarming from complete knowledge of a single bird, okay? Or schooling from a complete knowledge of a single fish, okay? So they contain many components that interact. Well, anybody can kind of think of that. But they interact in a hierarchical way. And that's important, and it'll be important for our looking at sustainability, okay? You have a diversity of components in a system. And I mean, think of humans. We've got different organs, we've got different cells, they're all interacting, even in the brain, it's diverse and highly connected. And that's another thing that's really important. They're highly connected, all right? But they also sacrifice some of their identity for the good of the whole. And that is Monty and his friend dissolvents. The idea that you get this loss of some of the properties in order for the system to function better, okay? So, and again, swarming would be an example of that, where, the real trick behind swarming actually is that the birds can see at an angle behind them, and so they kind of gauge their flight pattern based on that. So they're all dynamically interacting for the good of the whole swarm, say, to evade a shark if you're a school of fish, okay? And the interactions take place, again, across a number of scales. So that's hierarchy. And the other thing that's really important, and this is where I think it's going to be really relevant for sustainable ideas, is that living systems, which is what we're going to talk about, they adapt, evolve, and they self-organize. All right? Now, most people don't talk about these things, but for living systems, that's really important, because when you have an environment that's changing, if the organism doesn't adapt and evolve and figure out new ways to exist in the environment, it's going to die, right? Yes? No? Are we here? Okay. So I know that people who are life scientists don't like equations, so I'm not going to do that. I have a story for why I do this. When I was a young postdoc years ago, and I presented a poster at my first actual scientific poster at a real professional meeting. And it was at a biology meeting. It was at the Gerontology Society of America meeting. And one of my colleagues who was helping me with getting the actual data I needed came up to me and he said, "Taryn, crayons, crayons." And so from then on, I always try to have pictures. So what are we talking about? Let's think about some of the things from a more philosophical approach about living systems in particular. And I'm focusing on that because that's what we're talking about today with sustainability. What do they have to be able to do? Well, they have to be able to eat and process that to energy. They have to have rules about that, and they have to reproduce, and they have to be able to talk back and forth to an environment, and there are rules about how they behave, usually encoded in the genes. But the thing about this is that they talk to the environment, they go back and forth, they have rules, and they can adapt if something has, if there's a feedback that tells them, well, the environment is changing, okay? And we know this even in humans because we know that, for example, if you don't exercise your brain very much, then a lot of the neurons will go away. But we also know that if you start doing puzzles and you read, neurons will regenerate, that your brain is actually plastic. Not plastic, but not polyvinyl anyway, but it can actually regenerate things. For a long time we thought once you lose a neuron, that's it. But the answer is we can generate new kinds of connections now. I'm feeling very connected right now. So then we say, okay, that was an organism. Let's place that organism into an environment. All right? And what are the things that we would think about in terms of existing in an environment? Well, here are some of the various things. So here's that organism working, or organisms working in the environment, and they've got all kinds of environmental interactions in different ways. They have their the laws of operation. There may be evolution. They're going to be losing energy just because that happens in systems like this. And there's all of the processes that happen to essentially create new ones. All right? So now you've packed an organism into an environment, and then you say, all right, now I've looked at all of that. Well, what does it mean to be a complex system now? Okay, and why is this important? So down here, basically you have little pieces, and they slowly dissolve and become pieces that say, well, our group is going to be this one right here, and we're going to work together with these groups in this system, et cetera, so that we can survive. But it's not necessarily true that by looking at the little simple system on the bottom, you would necessarily know how the group is going to behave. And that's the idea of emergence. So you have hierarchies, emergence, and maybe along the way you need something new because the environment's telling you, oh, you know, we're changing, we're going to this kind of environment. So another structure appears to handle it. So these are the kinds of things that complexity theorists like me think about. Okay? How does this all work? And of course, along this whole way, you've got a time scale. This is all happening in time, okay? And it could be eons or it could be, you know, minutes. We don't know. I mean, what depends on the problem you're looking at. Are we good now? Questions? Take a breath. All right? So, what are some of the things that complexity science tells us? And we're just going to think complexity science. So, connectivity is important, okay? And loss of or addition of links can cause new kinds of behaviors or the loss of behaviors. Living systems, which is what we're talking about, adapt, evolve, and self-organize. No plan will work forever. Ooh, that's important if you're talking about sustaining, all right? You have to consider hierarchies of scale, and you may run into complex and chaotic behavior along the way. And sometimes chaotic behavior is nice, and sometimes it's not, okay? So,
Aaron,
yes?
is chaotic behavior internal or external?
It can be both,
Okay.
actually. It can be both. So, I'm not a sustainability expert at all. I'm a biologist, but only in a medical sense. And I'm old school, and so when I need to know something, the first place I turn to is the library. I like library. I like books, all right? So I went to the library, and I started to read books on sustainability. Now, before we do anything, though, all right, now it's audience participation time. All right, so when we talk about sustainability, what do you think of? What are the properties or things you think of? Come on, stick a hand up. Don't be shy. You're only on video. What? Consistency, okay. Let's really look at that. What do you mean by consistency?
Like, I guess preserving what's already there.
Okay, so something doesn't change in time. So constancy in time, okay, that's a good one. Yes, sir?
Equilibrium.
Equilibrium. Again, the idea of sitting at one place, not really changing, okay? Yes? Self-renewal. Ooh, does that sound like something we were talking about? Okay. Anybody else? All right, well, I hope you observed that some of those words I've already used. All right? So, sustainability actually is a complex idea in the sense of complex systems. And so capturing it uniquely is not something you can really do because it depends on how you're viewing it. Why do I say that? Well, because I went to the library and I looked it up. And these are some of the things I found as definitions, okay? And if you notice, what are they talking about when you read through it afterwards and take a minute, but you see what they're talking about are concepts that are related to complexity theory. In other words, sustainability is really a complexity theoretic construct. Now that's scary. That has real implications if you're trying to design sustainable constructs, okay? All right, everybody kind of read them all? All right, how am I doing on time? I have no idea. 4:26, okay, ooh, all right. So when I started looking for some ideas about, well, what do people say are the core ideas? And so you think about, well, one thing they say is intergenerational responsibility. So that's kind of a time-oriented thing. And they said systems thinking. I've changed that right away. We're going to say, no, systems thinking is too old and out of date. We need complexity thinking, okay? And of course, you know, justice, social justice along the way. You don't want countries to be stuck in poverty forever just because of certain conditions that they have. So if you think of societal sustainability, see now it's like, everybody know what Mad Libs is? Is there anybody that doesn't? Okay, sustainability, the word sustain or sustainability, every time I looked at it, there was sustainable management, sustainable architecture, sustainable business, in other words, you could put anything in there and ask, is it sustainable and how would we do it? So you have economic sustainability. Now think about that. What does think about all the things, the networks and the hierarchies that are involved in sustainable, in economic structures, and you realize, wow, that's a living system. And we already know how living systems behave, okay? Environmental, well, there we go. And by the way, because they're all connected through the seat of your pants there in the stool, the economic and environmental system are connected, and they're connected to the social systems, okay? So social sustainability, if you're just looking at that level of sustainability, is itself a complex system. And then I'm thinking, oh my God, sustainability is actually hierarchies of complex systems. This is really fun. So, and that of course is all related to quality of life. So here's an example of just municipal sustainability that I grabbed from an illustration. So let me pull everything in here. All right. So these are all of the things that they thought were involved in just being a sustainable municipality. And I think it's very easy to see that many of these themselves, well, first of all, they're all related to living systems. Many of them have sustainability issues themselves, and many of them are involved, well, they're all involved some way in each other. Okay? Questions yet? Okay. So when we get to the real point of it all, what we realize is that sustainability as a whole really involves interactions between all of these things. So we have hierarchies of subsystems that are themselves composed of hierarchies of subsystems that are living systems that are complex systems. So how would you imagine something like this would behave if you started to muddle with it? And the answer is, I think, unpredictably. It might be stable for a while, but then what do complex systems do? They adapt and evolve. And maybe what was stable will no longer be stable. And so the idea of capturing a sustainable behavior or system really is only kind of temporary in time. But that if you're a designer of sustainable ideas, you actually have to think of how things will change over time, that nothing is permanent, okay? And as I said, scale is important because when you start to think of hierarchies, you can think of, let me pull these all up here so that you can see them all. Oops. There. So different scales of organization. How can you look at the, well, okay, maybe geographical and physical isn't quite complex in and of itself until you start to think of, well, but there are layers, like I'm going to look at this region, this city in that region, this block in that region, that house in that block, and that, you know. And so you start to realize, well, maybe it is actually a hierarchy. And the same goes with ecological and jurisdictional types of sustainability. And as you layer these hierarchies, you get more and more complexity, okay? Now, why haven't you asked me what the word complexity means? I've been saying this word for, what, 25 minutes now? And you still haven't asked me, well, okay, but what is a complex system? I've given you examples of properties. So let me ask you this. What's the difference between the word complicated and the word complex? Because you all like to use them interchangeably, don't you? Yes? You think they're the same, but they're not. So what would the difference be? I gave you the answer, you just weren't listening for it. Okay, I'll tell. Twist my arm. If you have infinite knowledge of a system, okay, well, let's do it this way. Suppose I give you a watch, okay, and you take it apart reductionistically. You take it all apart, okay. Eventually, you can put it back together and figure out how it works, right? So infinite knowledge of the watch tells you how it works. And that's called complicated. A complex system, you can't do that. If I have infinite knowledge of an individual woman in the dorm, there's no way I could predict synchrony of your period. There's no way I could predict schooling or swarming or any of those things. So infinite knowledge of a single item doesn't tell you how the system behaves. Okay? Whereas infinite knowledge of wheels in the watch and putting them together, I can figure it out. So that's the difference between complex and complicated. So now you'll know how to use them correctly. So here's an example of some of the things that we think about when we start to think about sustainability. Okay? We have the natural system because we don't want to kill off all our trees because we want to unchop them now, you know. And so you unchop a tree by planting a new one. Okay? And so you have the economy and the infrastructure that you've got built, your city or whatever you want to call it. And then you have all of the behaviors. Well, this is kind of the whole human system here. Government, society, individual behaviors, et cetera, usage. I mean, it depends on what you're looking at, whether it's a business that you're looking at, you know, a very large international business, or whether it's just, you know, a city behavior of your bus system. All of these things can be looked at as complex systems. So in the end, I started thinking about it. Well, I think these are the words that most people would agree with when you talk about, well, what does sustainable mean, okay? In other words, you're thinking about it in terms of a lifespan. You want to be able to have your population thrive and all of that, but you don't want to overburden the system, because overburdening the system, what is that like? Well, that's like perturbing the system, and we know that living systems, when you perturb them, can have all kinds of odd behaviors, unpredictable behaviors, chaotic behaviors. They can fall apart, all that kind of stuff. And so one that is a sustainable society, then, I think, meets this definition. But the problem with these definitions is that they have a kind of perpetuity built into them. And my argument is that complexity theory says you cannot do that, that you have to be constantly on your guard. So here's some of the closing thoughts I had, all right? Let's talk about how complexity theory informs us, really, about what sustainability is. So here's what I put together for myself to try to explain. You have to manage sustainability. You have to think about it not just in the moment, but across time, okay? You have to manage hierarchies and multiple subsystems that are always evolving. And because of that, they can adapt, they can change, and you may get a nice behavior now, but later on, you may not. And so a choice that you make now may have an impact down the road. And so sometimes putting something in place now because it works now may not be the best choice. For example, well, what is it, the Native American Indian, 10 generations? It's something you do now. As long as it doesn't affect 10 generations, then we'll do it. So that was their idea. So, and they were smart. They knew about complexity theory way before us. So I'm going to argue that sustainability should be viewed as a complexity theoretic construct in and of itself, and that it carries with it all of the ideas that we've just talked about what complex systems behave like. And so you have to be able to constantly be aware, on your guard, for how you change and modify a system in order to make something better, or as you think, better. So this is the, basically, I like this definition in the end. I think that it really is a nice idea. But again, complexity theory says you will inevitably fail if you don't constantly adapt and evolve your planning, because nothing is forever. Mother Nature will find a way to change things, okay? So there you are. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Oh, that's right. I have to talk.
Because we're recording this to get a good sound recording, raise your hand, and Dr. Rader or myself will run over to you with the microphone and speak into the microphone.
Do I need to turn off my wireless now? Okay.
I want to see the running part. Can you go back 4 slides? I'll tell you when, because I may have miscounted. Okay, that one. So one of the things that's so interesting about that slide is while it indicates a kind of recursive relationship between the natural system and the human system, it puts the human system outside, or the natural system outside the human system. And I think that's interesting because we tend to think about this problem that way. That is, sort of, the human system is separated from, divorced from the natural system, right? That we can extract it. It's the science fiction model in some ways. If we screw up the natural system here, we'll go to Mars, and then we'll screw up that system, and then we'll go to Pluto, and right. But really, you and I both know that the science says we're never going elsewhere. I mean, we may go to Mars and maybe mess with it, but we're not going to Betelgeuse, right? And so that extraction of the natural, of the notion of the natural from the human system, I guess I want to understand, it's a question I've been wrestling with for a long time. Are we able to actually understand ourselves within, as constituents within a complex system in order to put the natural or the human back in the natural?
Well, I have to admit to something I did. I forgot the next slide after this. I had intended to put a slide in here that actually embedded them in continually smaller sets within each other. And the argument was going to be you can't separate them, that we sit inside the natural system, and that the natural ecosystem is actually around us, if you will. And so we are like a Venn diagram. You all remember Venn diagrams, kind of, maybe? How many didn't have Venn diagrams? Okay. All right, so I don't think we will ever understand ourselves well enough, and I think that's part of the challenge for doing any sort of work with complex systems, whether it's sustainability work, is that you're always going to have one of the connections, like we did when I wiped out that one bridge. There will always be a bridge that's not there that should be there, and that will change the behavior of the system. And so we have to do the best we can. But that's the idea of what I think of as managing a system dynamically, rather than saying, okay, I'm going to plant 1,000 trees that'll give us enough oxygen and we're good. Does that kind of answer the question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess it does, except, sorry. I mean, the model that you've given is a dire model, right? It suggests to me, it hints to me, that we may not be sophisticated enough. Mother Nature will out, right? But whether we'll be part of it is the big question in the end.
Yes, I think so.
And that's the part that's hard to grasp when you think about complexity, and that's one of the reasons I think people want to not think about it as a complex system, because it needs to be androcentric rather than...
Exactly. The fact is that we don't understand a single individual's behavior well enough, much less, I mean, the whole field of psychology, what is it about? It's how do people in groups work together, and interact, and, we just don't know enough. So I think what complex systems theory tells us is you have to be constantly on your guard as you're making changes. You have to imagine, well, if I perturb it, what's a worst case scenario versus a best case scenario? Because that's all you're going to be able to do. And you may never predict the exact scenario. Your worst case scenario may actually not be the worst case scenario. So, any other questions? Because Deirdre and I can go on forever about this stuff. Come on. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I found your talk very insightful. I grew up in Canada as a systems engineer, and at the time we had many detailed discussions with Buzz Hollings, who's since moved to, I think, University of Florida, Henry Regier, who at the time was in Guelph. We discussed these exact issues, and it often came down to sort of your last statement, which was, we have to think about, the best outcome or the worst outcome, and then I was hoping you could reflect a little bit on some of the values and the judgments about how do we determine, which possible equilibria is Pareto optimal for which groups of society?
Well, you've just entered a whole, which I mentioned with just socio-justice, because that's a whole field in and of itself is, if I'm a small country, poor country somewhere, I don't want to be shortchanged in all of these changes. So we have to be very clear about that. It's a global process, okay, that when we think about it, and we don't think about it that way, unfortunately. We think, everybody wants the best for themselves because as a species, that we're very selfish for the most part. And certainly in this country we are. And so the challenge is to how to get people to think broadly about it. We don't teach sociology in high school, and nobody's required to take sociology and anthropology in college. It's kind of an elective. And so what really we need to understand these things, because I think it would help people if you understand, inbred biases about what is important. I mean, even the whole idea of what I just talked about and what I chose to speak about is what I thought was important to speak about. Based on my history, my life, my training, it may not be relevant to you at all. You had a whole different history, so I'm giving you my biased perception of everything and saying this is what I think. And usually when I give a woman's studies talk, that's the first thing I talk about is what my background is, so you know where I stand, as a scientist and as a scholar. Because in fact, those things make a difference. Yes?
The only other thing that I might want to challenge a little bit
Sure.
is, as Deirdre mentioned, this diagram here, brings back memories of the scientific revolution, thinking that we can control, manipulate,
Right.
predict, dominate the natural environment. And the one word I noticed that you mentioned sort of over and over again was hierarchies.
Yeah.
And I mean, traditionally, this paradigm when we're trying to predict and control the natural systems, brings to mind, traditional male-dominated hierarchies like the Catholic Church that persecuted Galileo.
Right.
And so today, at least in my community, we tend to think not in terms of hierarchies, which you used about 8 times in your slides, but rather in terms of what we call SOHO, self-organizing, holarchic, and open systems, where holarchies suggest not necessarily a top-down, hierarchy, but this type of interconnected network of communities.
That's excellent. I never heard of it.
I can Google Soho.
Well, they'll probably come up with somewhere. Where is it, in California, Soho? No, I'd not heard about it. But still, I think it's great to hear about that. But the fact, so that speaks to self-organization, okay, in the model of complexity. Yeah, but they still have to sit inside of something. And so they are part of a system themselves that is things above it and things below it, as well as things kind of lateral to it. So,
But you're not talking about this in a political sense.
No.
Right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
the context that Jason's talking about, right?
Yeah.
So when you say above, it doesn't necessarily mean controlling as in superior. It means ordinally related.
right, or organizationally related maybe. Like, I have a self-organized committee, but that committee has to report to the mayor. And the mayor has to, so it's not necessarily, it could be a power structure. even though my group is really neat and cool and we're all equal, but we're not equal necessarily all the way up and down, you know?
So what is the inherent hierarchy structure if it is in fact not just self-organized or in some sense equal? What is the hierarchy of determinant?
I don't think there's a unique one. I think it depends on the vision that you want to take. It can be political, it can be biological, it can be ecological, economical. I mean, I went to the library, I must have taken out 8 books that said sustainable development and read through them. And it was, like I said, it was a mad lib. You pick the thing you want to look at and then go through it. And the things that came up were hierarchies, social justice, temporal behaviors, et cetera. You know, and I think it didn't matter really, so I've kind of tried to cast it in that general way. But I think it very much depends on the view you take.
Can I interject too? I
Sure.
mean, one of the interesting things that you said, Taryn, that at least from a sort of a philosophical perspective, that is the most striking, is the idea of evolution and adaptation in this, right? Because what the hierarchy on any way that you want to look at it from any perspective may not be the same hierarchy that's going to be in existence for
Exactly.
the next generation, right? I mean, I think that's the kind of thing. So, and I'm just thinking about, classical economics theory is based on the idea of a rational individual. Well, who's to say that what constitutes a rational individual, even if Adam Smith, for example, had it exactly right for 1780, that kind of rational individual even exists today?
Exactly.
Right. So in some sense, this to me the scariest thing about it is that the foundations of knowledge are suddenly very on like surfing, riding the wave that may or may not be there
Exactly.
for the next generation.
And as you're surfing, you have to imagine this kind of complex structure that's evolving based on what's down there, you know, that they're surfing on and how it's changing. And you're trying to predict now with this idea of keeping everything kind of from falling apart. That's your goal. You want to keep the structure from falling apart. You want to keep everybody happy and, you know, healthy and all. You're over here trying to say, well, if I move on the wave like this, will I go over and crash, or can I ride it out for a while until I can make another maneuver? You know, so it's very complex. Yes.
I liked your symbol with the stool with the
Yes.
three-legged stool, because I think, I mean, a lot of it comes down, I'm sorry, I'm not talking. A lot of it comes down to the quality of life, which you had on the top there, and then you had the environment on the bottom, and economic and social. Because to me, and that quality, what is quality of life?
Right.
You know, for me, it's one thing if I'm over in China or India or a developing country, it's something else. But I think with the environment, we all are depending upon clean air, clean water, soil. I mean, once that stuff goes away, like you say, I mean, we could start looking for another place to live, but that gets very complicated as far as trying to get us to another planet. That gets kind of complicated, yeah. So I like, I mean, it's kind of a simple approach to look at it, but it's a very, you know, compelling way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's not mine. I took it from somewhere, as you could tell. I think the thing that really interested me about thinking about all of this was how sustainability was so intimately tied to living systems, and how we know just from studies that we've done with bugs and you know, simple little bugs and wolves and, you know, prey-predator models, how you can get all kinds of behaviors just from pushing the parameters in the model just a little bit, and suddenly you go from a nice kind of behavior like this to all over the place. You know, very simple changes. And in fact, you've all heard of the butterfly effect, right? Well, that came from an individual who noted that in a particular mathematical model he had, a very simple model, that, gee, can I write on this? Oh, the model was this. Okay, so xn means the population size at the nth cycle. Think of it as bugs that grow seasonally, so every summer. So xn represents the amount of bugs on the nth summer. And I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was yellow. And xn plus 1 is the amount of bugs next summer. So you might want to know that if you're a farmer. You know, like, oh my God, how do I have to buy, how much spray do I need, whatever. That is what we call the simplest nonlinear model. And just to tell you how hard that was to study when I started, that is my PhD thesis. Now they teach it in sophomore math. Okay? But the idea is that as B changes, you go from behaviors like this to behaviors like this to behaviors like this to behaviors like this. Just by pushing the parameter into different domains. So if you think about, well, that's a simple nonlinear model. It is what we call the simplest nonlinear model. If that's what happens with a simple nonlinear model, and we all know that people are nonlinear, okay, and you put a bunch of nonlinear people into a group, which is probably even more nonlinear, maybe not, maybe somewhat, but you know, maybe you get swarming instead of that. But the point is that a lot of this behavior is unpredictable. And so if you're making thoughts about how to make a sustainable environment, and you misestimate the value of B, you could end up going from a nice sustainable curve like this, where things kind of equilibrate, to, well, it's going to go like this. You're going to have a good year and a bad year, good year and a bad year, good year, to, oh, I can't even predict anything because it's now chaotic. So when we think about these structures and their evolution, this is the idea. I think what complexity theory says is that the idea of sustainability is not something you could say, I do this and I'm good. You know, that you have to look at the idea of sustainability as itself a complexity-based idea. And that, so you always have to be on your guard. You have to be always looking at the control of systems and all of that. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
So is the answer to how do you unchop a tree, you can't? Or is the answer, it's the wrong question? Ask a different question.
Well, I think it's a little of both, actually.
Yeah?
I think you can't unchop a tree. And this is I'll give you a simpler example of that. Suppose I give you a glass puzzle. All right, I've painted a picture on a pane of glass. And I've cut out all the pieces so that they're like a jigsaw puzzle, okay? And I give it to you on a board, and I say, put it together. And you accidentally drop it. And so there are shards and things all over it. But you manage to put all the pieces kind of back together again. Will you ever be able to put that piece of puzzle back perfectly? There you go. Yes, sir.
How you doing? Okay, everybody can hear me? Okay.
He's got his smooth radio voice on.
It was interesting. I guess it's to make it more relatable for, you know, my generation. As you were, like I said, going through your slides and talking about sustainability and complex theory, it made me think about the movie The Matrix. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with it. And in the film, as he captured Morpheus, like I said, Agent Anderson, he discussed the, I guess more like the ecological standpoint that he described. He truly challenges the basis of humans being mammals as opposed to humans being viruses,
humans
right?
Being a virus, yes.
So I guess my question is now understanding complex theory more, looking at it from a more ecological perspective. Do you feel humans will ever truly grasp a more, equilibrium with their surrounding environment, i.e., the natural system?
I don't think there ever will be a global equilibrium. Because things are constantly changing. And that's, I think, one of the main things that I'm trying to get across, perhaps not as well as I should, is that the concept of equilibrium is antithetical to complexity theory, all right? There's just no such thing, all right? Things change constantly. Death, taxes, and change, the only constants, okay? So I think it's the wrong way to look at the problem. How do we equilibrate things? I think really the way to do it, at least as a start, would always be to constantly be looking at how do we optimize based on whatever conditions there are, so that certain constraints are true, like nobody is poor, or everybody gets an equal share, or some set of constraints. Optimize what we've got based on that, to keep that going for as long as possible until we see that things aren't working, and then we have to reconsider. Okay? Does that kind of get at it? Okay. Phew, I was hoping you weren't asking me if we were a virus.
I was sort of hoping he was asking that.
I think in some ways we actually are. Or at least certain components of the population are. When you look at how viruses behave, it's actually quite true what Agent Anderson says, but not for everybody. I think that's the problem. Some of us are viruses and some of us are white blood cells. See, I'm white, so I'm a white blood cell. So. Anybody else? Oh, come on. This has been such a good discussion. Let's keep it going. Yes, sir.
You were talking about the Matrix. I'm not an expert. Sorry. In the Matrix, I think they had the choice to take the red pill or the blue pill,
Exactly.
and one of them was, if you took the red pill, you would see reality as it actually was. And
Right.
so I just want to reflect a little bit. I think if we actually take the red pill, we'll understand that natural systems today, you were talking about the need for, a pristine environment and clean air. And I was shocked, but apparently even the most pristine environments like the Brazilian Amazon was, significantly altered by First Nations people, hundreds of years ago. And even the forests in New England apparently were completely modified by the worms that the colonists brought with them. And so what we think of as today, some type of an ideal natural environment, in fact, is nothing like it was hundreds of years ago before humans intervened. So I like your thought, and my only comment is, should we think in terms of like Schumpeter, some type of, creative destruction? Some people say that it's important not to intervene in terms of, putting out forest fires and things,
Yes.
so that nature can, on a small scale, have these type of interventions and renew the system, so that over time we have some type of a natural, process to renew the system.
That's a good question. There's a wonderful book, I don't know if you've read it, called 1492. It's about that thick, and it talks about what happened the year after Columbus got here and how that impacted the future. And it's a wonderful book because it talks about the fact that, there were no horses, and now there are horses. And all the different things that happened just because Columbus arrived, all right? Diseases that occur, all these things that happen. So I think the answer is we've as humans have been constantly modifying. Our very existence modifies, It's kind of like in physics, we talk about when you observe a system, you automatically perturb it because the act of observing it changes it. And so, and from an anthropology perspective, that's a challenge because if you want to study a tribe, do you stay away and look at them through a telescope, the anthropologist's dilemma, and look at them through a telescope so you don't involve yourself in their life and therefore perturb the situation? Or do you go in and by your very presence in their culture suddenly change the whole thing, and then you're not getting an actual picture of what they used to be, but you want to study what they're about? So the whole idea of existence perturbing the system, I think, is exactly what the question revolves around. And so what we need to think about is how does our existence perturb this world and to keep it from going off the deep end? I believe that we should let forest fires burn as long as they're not man-made. But if a lightning strikes a forest somewhere and it burns, I think you should let it burn. I think it's a very natural phenomenon.
The crisis with that, though, Taryn, is that it presumes we did not previously perturb it, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
in France, there's only 5%, a little less now than 5% of what we think at the height of the forestation of France existed, right?
Yes.
So if a lightning strike occurs in France and you burn, 20% of
True.
what's left of the 5%, we already chopped down the other 95%.
That's true.
And so I'm not sure we can ever, we tend to want to get to a restart, right? But we're so far down the rabbit hole that I'm not sure that's possible
Yeah.
anymore. It's,
I think you're probably right. I wouldn't want to have all the forest burned down because I said, oh, well, it's a natural event. You know, whereas if I had had, you know, the other 95% of the forest there, I could have made that choice and said, well, you know, it's okay, it'll only be 5%, you know.
Well, I think the other question, too, is why do we actually put out forest fires? And probably not to save forest, it's to save people's property.
Yes.
And to
Well,
save
that's true.
people, right? So if there was some remote island in the Aleutian Islands that suddenly caught fire, I don't think we would be spending millions of dollars trying to put out forest fires and endanger the lives of firefighters to do it, right? I mean, we save ourselves. We don't really save the forests. So
I was watching, I think it was a PBS show about this island somewhere, I'm guessing it's in the South Pacific, where it's so low to the water level, with the water rising from the ice melting, it's actually going to flood the island and their whole culture will disappear. I don't see anybody running out to save them. They're filming. You know, so. And yet, for all we know, if we save them, that might send the whole world in another direction. But we don't know that, you know.
well, then on that note, let's thank Dr. Terwin.